Subscribe and tap the bell. Twice a day, we bring you the real words of the Stoics, not paraphrased, not softened. Around the year 55, a boy was born into slavery in Hierapolis, a city in Phrygia in what is now Turkey. Under Roman law he was property from birth, no legal standing, no right to his own name, no right to refuse an order. His name, Epictetus, isn't even a birth name in the ordinary sense. It comes from the Greek word for acquired. He was property so completely that even his name recorded the fact of being owned. He belonged to a man named Epictetus, who had himself once been a slave and had risen to become a powerful administrative secretary to the Emperor Nero. It was Epictetus, historians generally agree, who allowed his young slave to attend the lectures of Musonius Rufus, one of the leading Stoic teachers in Rome at the time. This detail alone is worth sitting with. The philosophy that would eventually teach millions of free people how to think was first handed to a man who wasn't even legally permitted to own the clothes on his back. Musonius Rufus wasn't a safe teacher to be associated with either. Called the Roman Socrates by later writers, he'd already been exiled from Rome once under Nero, in the year 65, and would be exiled again after that, exile being a punishment Romans regarded as barely short of death, a total severing from the city that gave a citizen's life its meaning. He also broke with nearly every other philosopher of his time by insisting that philosophy belonged to women as much as men, and reportedly trained his own daughters in it as rigorously as he trained his sons. A teacher that uncompromising, teaching a student with no legal rights at all, isn't a small detail in Epictetus's story. It's the first sign of the man he would become. Later writers couldn't resist adding drama to what happened to his body. Origen, writing more than a century afterward, claimed Epictetus twisted his leg as a punishment, and that Epictetus endured it so calmly he simply warned his master the bone would break, and when it did, said only, "Did I not tell you that it would break?" It's a striking story, and you'll find it repeated everywhere. But two earlier, more careful sources disagree with it. Simplicius says he'd been lame since childhood. The pseudo-encyclopedia blames rheumatism. We don't actually know which version is true, and a channel built on quoting real words instead of comfortable legends owes you that uncertainty rather than the more dramatic version. What isn't in dispute is that he lived and taught with a physical disability for most of his adult life, in an empire that had no accommodation to offer him and wouldn't have cared to. Freedom, when it came sideways. Nero died in the year 68, and Epictetus, the man who had, by then, assisted Nero's own suicide at his request, was eventually executed for it under a later emperor, Domitian. Somewhere in that upheaval, without any surviving formal document to mark the date, Epictetus became a free man. He stayed in Rome and began teaching philosophy openly, no longer as anyone's property, but as a former slave standing in front of students who'd been born free and had never once had to think about the distinction. It didn't last. Around the year 93, Domitian, increasingly paranoid about philosophers and their influence over Roman opinion, banished every philosopher from the city. Epictetus left for Nicopolis, in western Greece, and there did something remarkable for a man who'd spent the first half of his life as someone else's legal possession. He built his own school. It earned a serious reputation. Wealthy and well-connected Romans traveled there specifically to study under him, including a young Greek named Arrian, who sat in Epictetus's classroom taking the notes that would preserve his teacher's words for every reader since. Arrian didn't stay a student forever. He went on to a Roman political career that would have been unthinkable for his old teacher, appointed to the Senate, made consul, and under the Emperor Hadrian named governor of Cappadocia, only the second Greek in Roman history to hold that post. The empire that had once owned Epictetus outright ended up, one classroom later, handing a province to the man who wrote his lectures down. Epictetus himself never wrote a word of it down. Everything we have, the discourses, and the short handbook drawn from them known as the Enchiridion, survives because Arrian published his lecture notes around the year 108, years before his own political career even began. Every line quoted on this channel from Epictetus passes through that same chain: a slave who taught out loud, a free student who wrote it down, and translators like Elizabeth Carter who carried it into English centuries later. Nothing in it was written for publication. It was spoken to a room, the same way Musonius Rufus had once spoken to a room that included him. One line from that record fits his own life so precisely it's hard to imagine he wrote it about anyone else. Remember that you are an actor in a drama of such a kind as the author pleases to make it. If short, of a short one; if long, of a long one. If it be his pleasure you should act a poor man, a cripple, a governor, or a private person, see that you act it naturally. For this is your business, to act well the character assigned you; to choose it is another's. A poor man. A cripple. He wasn't speaking in the abstract. He'd been assigned both parts by a world that never once consulted him about the casting, and his entire philosophy grew out of insisting that neither one determined how well he could play them. He taught at Nicopolis for roughly 4 decades and died around the year 135, by which point his reputation had already outgrown the room he taught in. Marcus Aurelius, born after Epictetus's death, encountered his teaching secondhand. A tutor named Rusticus handed the young future emperor a copy of the Discourses, and Marcus carried those ideas for the rest of his life, eventually writing his own private journal in the same spirit. A man born with no legal right to his own body ended up shaping the private thinking of the most powerful man in the world, one full generation after he was gone, without either of them ever meeting. That's the actual shape of the story, without embellishment. Not a slave who was magically freed by wisdom. Not a clean rags to riches arc. A man who was property, who studied philosophy anyway because one owner happened to allow it. Who was maimed or born lame under conditions no one can now fully verify. Who was freed by circumstance rather than justice, exiled by an emperor's paranoia, and who built something in Nicopolis that outlasted the empire that had once owned him, using words he never even wrote down himself. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and the Stoics they trained, straight from the source, twice a day.